Huye, and thank you so much for joining this online series where we're talking to experts and entrepreneurs to learn what from their work we can apply to climate action and, more importantly, to climate justice. You'll leave with the one key thing you can do to make a positive impact. We are so lucky to be joined today by Nikki Silvestri. She's the founder and CEO of Soil and Shadow, entrepreneur, serial nonprofit executive director, and nationally recognized thought leader, in addition to being an international keynote speaker. Not to mention being named one of the Root's 100 most influential African Americans. This woman is amazing, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us, Nikki.
Thank you. That was probably one of the best intros I've ever had. That was awesome.
You deserve it all. So you have this lifetime of accomplishments. Can you take us back to the beginning, before you started Soil and Shadow, before you served on the board of Greenpeace? What were you up to that shaped your current worldview?
I really have to take it back to my ancestry for that one, which is, it's so beautiful. I've spent a lot of time realizing with my Black friends in particular, that so many of us had people in our family that were the first to do something. Right?
Wow.
Like my grandmother was one of the first social workers in Los Angeles County, Black social workers. My dad's sister was one of the first police officers in Inglewood County, like things like that. And my grandfather was also a pretty famous singer and composer in Hollywood. And so the activism in my family in terms of being the first, I don't think any Black folk really escaped that. We were activists just because we were first over the last 100 years. And so then I think my parents took that and they started, I had 7 older foster brothers and grew up with them in our home. And then that became 2 group homes, and then that became a foster family agency. And so that was the work that I grew up around, was my parents helping Black and brown families in particular try to keep their children or try to get their children placed in safe homes. And so they were explaining to me really early on systemic discrimination and the hardships that Black and brown people have faced and why it hurts our ability to raise our own children, things like that. So I don't think I knew that the for-profit world existed except on television, you know? This was always going to be who I was. And then the climate stuff came around. The really early things, the early stripes of it, because back in the early 90s, the ozone layer was like the big thing, right? And we're going to burn because the ozone layer is going away. And so I was that kid wearing the ozone layer t-shirts, and I really took it in. When that kind of stuff hits you in 2nd grade, you just really take it in. And then Captain Planet, there was a bunch of media around the early 90s that I think just deeply impacted me. So when An Inconvenient Truth came out when I was in college, I was ready to be activated.
What a journey. And that is so amazing in terms of the education you were receiving just by osmosis through your parents' work and really seeing it versus hearing about it.
That's right.
That's incredible. Can you share kind of the tipping point then for creating Soil and Shadow? And for those who don't know, this is an amazing coaching and consulting firm that Nikki has founded. And the mission is to bring social and environmental entrepreneurs more impact in their work and joy in their lives, which is incredible. We usually don't hear that second part. So what was that tipping point for you?
Yeah, that, whew. So I spent my time in the early part of my career being a nonprofit executive director, working at the local level with food systems and food insecurity and economic development, and then working on economic development at the national level with climate solutions and green collar jobs and things like that. So approaching things from a systemic change point of view, for me, was the land of breakdown and overwhelm. And I had a pretty deep breakdown in 2014 and just kind of flamed out of my national climate change role and needed to go into a hole for a few months to figure out who I was and what was really going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's such a big picture for all of us, right? Like the founding of Soil and Shadow in terms of impact and joy at the same time is we can't have impact if we're broken down. And so many of us that are in social impact work, the problems that we're facing are these huge problems. Like fundamentally, what we're trying to do is to get humans to not express the inner violence that we seem to have onto each other and the planet. And doing that systemically is too big of a lift for any one person. And that's the thing I think I had to come to, is like me trying to get humans to not damage the earth at large and to see some kind of discernible impact over the course of my lifetime that I could point back to something I specifically did to change. Is basically trying to do the work of sages of 2,000 years, right? Like people have been trying to solve that problem of the inner violence of humans and how we express it for thousands of years. So then what can I do? And Soil and Shadow is really born of that. Like what the work of the individual is to support other individuals with having stability and the kind of leadership mindset to know that we may not make it out of this as a species. Like the things that we're doing to ourselves and the planet, we have maybe a 50-50 chance, as far as I'm concerned, of making it out of this. But the goal and the point is that we have a better chance if we can be present right now and not sacrifice our joy to try to get something in the future. The more we can do that, the more innovation and imagination and creativity can actually create those design solutions that will create the impact that we're looking for. So it's kind of counterintuitive. It's that thing where like the less attached you are, the more effective you are, but it's true. And so Soil and Shadow as a firm, we try to connect this with executive coaching and leadership development for individuals and leaders who are at the top of their game in the social impact work, and also translate that into organizational development and strategic advising for specific projects and initiatives.
That's incredible. I think just starting from such a philosophical place and really rooted in human nature and what we've seen pan out over lifetimes, right? But recognizing that in order to be able to then contend with, well, in 2020, how is it that we operate and how can we actually find both that impact and joy through the systems that we've grown up in and that we think are what's working now for us. So that's really, really cool. And it resonates so hard with me. I think for me, growing up around the private sector, it was always just kind of, I had my moment of, well, if I want to make huge scalable change on climate in a positive manner, it has to come from business. And why not start with the biggest players / offenders in oil and gas and fossil fuels and try to change it from the inside? And after a career sort of within those big players, took a moment to step back and say, everybody's missing the point because no one's talking about climate justice in the way that we need to. They talk about the technology, they talk about the financing, they talk about how to go to market, but we're kind of missing this human element, which is so baked into your work. So I'd love to hear your definition of climate justice and why you think it's so easily ignored.
My definition of climate justice is creating an equitable, healthy situation for humans and the planet to interact with one another, just at large. And I think it's so easily ignored because rooting ourselves in justice in the mainstream brings up interpersonal and emotional issues for people. The word justice is triggering. And so, because it implies that injustice is happening, and then are we responsible for that? Like it immediately starts to bring up feelings of shame and judgment for people.
Right.
And those of us who live on the people of color, low income, historically oppressed community side of the house, we're fine with discomfort. We walk around with discomfort. The mainstream does not. And so fundamentally, it's that discomfort gap that's really impacting the climate justices movement, their ability to really impact the mainstream. And so one of the things that Like concretely, that's why Soil and Shadow focuses on these philosophical concepts in our leadership development work. Because so much of executive leadership is the ability to sit with discomfort and make hard decisions quickly so that you can distribute resources and manage people and move things around in a way that's going to serve the whole, knowing that people are going to be mad at you, knowing that making hard decisions means that there will be consequences and mistakes made along the way. And doing that over and over again is very stressful and very hard. And being able to balance emotionally intelligent leadership with strategy and strategic leadership is just a skill you have to practice. And having someone hold you throughout that is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love how it starts philosophical and then very quickly it just becomes, well, this is practical. This is how we're going to do it. And this is how it's going to happen in an inclusive way. And you've already sort of hit these parallels between social impact work and what we need to see around better climate justice work, right? You mentioned discomfort, being okay with that and sort of using it as a means to think about how you can lead better. You also mentioned it's super heavy and exhausting work because it's systemic and it takes a lot to work through that every single day. We're not building, an advertisement for toilet paper. it's broader than that. So, what have you learned at Soil and Shadow, and also just as a coach consultant, in terms of breaking down those paradigms for us to tackle this big social impact kind of climate justice work?
The biggest thing I've learned is that if it's fun and if it's joyful, as a first step, creating that more of the carrot versus the stick invitation for people is likely to work. As a firm, we've influenced somewhere between $20 and $40 million over the course of our tenure because so many of our clients are investors and philanthropists. And they are trying to distribute their funds in ways that do create both joy and impact. So as an example, right, one of our biggest clients is the No Regrets Initiative, which is it's a 7,700 acre working ranch. It's a investment firm. It's a nonprofit entity that does education, and it's a philanthropic organization. So all four of those entities are under the umbrella of No Regrets. And the mission is to regenerate the soils of North America. And the way that they do that, like their mission statement for how they do that, is create more beauty and complexity. Wow. Which is amazing, right? We work with them on their community engagement strategy and their media infrastructure. And watching their investment officer talk about using beauty and complexity as investment rubrics and as ways to look at ROI with their investments, and the faces of other investors when they think about, well, how do you do that? And they have this whole analysis around human capital, economic capital, and ecological capital, and the way those three types of capital have interacted over the years. But the fact that they're creating an invitation around beauty and complexity means that people are curious and they're leaning in, even though it's going to be very uncomfortable to talk about the different type of ROI you're going to get on the other end of that, right?
Totally.
Another one of our clients is the Calliopeia Foundation, which is a philanthropic organization. And their mission statement is about spirit, ecology, and culture, which is like who I am, right? Yeah. And their whole thing is taking spirit out of the conversation when it comes to ecology and culture means that you're missing a conversation. But talking about spirit is slightly uncomfortable for folks.
Sure.
So we've done a lot of work together with convenings and community engagement strategies to really look at how to bring people together to see each other as human, and then how to distribute the success of that work to show other philanthropic foundations that when you get people together from a place of soul and just ask them to see each other, the wildfire effect that has on their efficiency and ability to innovate and ability to create even better solutions is exponential. But that requires it requires depth. And so those are just two examples of our clients, but our clients are really on the cutting edge and revolutionary like that. Like they're really looking at the core drivers of humanity. And it's just an honor that so many of them are in the philanthropic and investment space, because it means that they can really impact things because they're distributing resources.
Wow. Yeah. I think that's so irresistible that, they're thinking about new metrics and really human aspects of the work rather than let's look at this time scale, this ROI, like the KPIs, the key performance indicators that we tend to sink back into in the business world. But again, the human dimension is kind of what makes it irresistible for people because they care and it's personal. And that's sort of what I've seen climate change, climate crisis struggle with is people can just not care because it's so far away and it doesn't impact them in their neighborhood, in their network of friends. So those are amazing examples. Thank you. I'm sure you've seen a wealth of wrongs in your cause to rebuild these systems. In boardroom culture, even maybe surprising individual stories for clients that you've coached and worked with. And we've talked about how we have to first kind of unlearn those in order to do work that's more impactful and joyful. Can you share maybe the most shocking thing that you've learned in your work on your path to creating this new type of social justice work?
The most shocking thing I've learned is how quickly women disregard ourselves, no matter how accomplished we are.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's shocking and it's not, but I think every time I see a woman who has this rap sheet of this incredible career who comes to me for executive coaching, and the type of executive coaching I do is really deep around like, give me the core soul stuff that you're struggling with. And then we're going to connect that to management techniques and conflict resolution and all of that, right?
Yeah.
And so much of the core struggle they have is any of the stuff I'm doing worth it? Just any of it. And it's the part of it that's not surprising is what I said in the beginning about like, if you're women tend to be pretty pragmatic.
Yeah.
And I think
survival.
Exactly. And so if we're looking at like, can we actually impact the system?
Mm-hmm.
And there's some real reconciliation around that, you can feel like you're not doing anything at all because you look at the big picture and where things are going and you're like, nothing I have done has made a dent. But the biggest thing that they come out of that process with is the understanding of the nonlinear nature of change, right? And this is so relevant, especially when it comes to the justice movement and social racial change in particular. When I think about the history of African American progress, it looks very nonlinear. It can look like the racial equity has just backslid so much when it comes to wealth disparities and health disparities and overt hate crimes and racism being okay in a way that it hasn't been in decades, right? At the same time, there's a whole new generation of young Black kids who identity-wise are not connecting their first origin story with oppression. They're connecting their first origin story with complexity and multiculturalism and wholeness and gender fluidity and like all of these things, right? They're feeling their identities are outside of the box, which means they have the possibility of building something way beyond. And we did that. That was generations of the work of individuals and families creating new narratives and new stories for us to live by. So it's teaching that the dichotomy between our narrative and our story as a species and how that creates our reality with what it looks like the concrete things about the systems and the economies that we're creating says about our story. Those two things can feel very divergent. And part of leadership is the ability to hold the divergence in what those two stories are telling and being able to believe in that soul narrative enough to keep running with it. And that is I think the shocking thing is how often women forget that in particular.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, that's a lot to take in and digest, and I think it will resonate with a lot of our listeners who are in this work and really contending with that divergence. And on top of that divergence, sort of back to your point about social impact work is heavy, and it's sometimes feels like you're not making any progress, right? So um, what's maybe the lowest point that you faced in your journey? How did you come back from that and work through it? And where do you derive hope? How do you process that? I think that's a lesson that a lot of people will find value in.
Mm-hmm. So I'll go back to this breakdown I had in 2014, right? That was absolutely the lowest point that I hit. And it was deeply personal as well as professional. The year that I became a nonprofit executive director at a national level was the year I found out that my husband and I were going to have deep fertility issues. And when I signed on to be the ED at that organization, I told the board, like, I left my previous organization so that I could have babies. Like, that was the reason. So I'm taking on all this responsibility, but I'm not putting my child having plans on hold. That is actually my biggest priority right now. And they were like, great, we support women's leadership. And so finding out that we were going to have fertility issues, and that combined with the learning curve of moving from local to national leadership, was just too much for my system to handle. I was not expecting the utter devastation of that to really hit me as hard as it did. And then that combined with working in DC and talking to drunk climate scientists, because that's how so much happens in DC, is you get together after hours and you drink in bars. Drunk climate scientists will scare the living hell out of anybody and basically make it seem like nothing's going to work. There is no way the fossil fuel industry is going to shift in the amount of time that it needs to. We're going to die. I am buying land on Madagascar. And I'm just like, what in the world am I supposed to do with this? So the combination of this deep personal and professional existential crisis just put me in a dark place. It was also my Saturn return. So I know I was like all of it. It was all of it, B, like all of it at the same time. And it took a solid year, I would say, to recover from that. I kept getting headhunted for all these different opportunities, and I said no to all of them because I knew that if I went into another leadership position where I was not going to be able to perform, and I was not going to be able to lead from a place of wholeness. I was in a place of brokenness. And luckily, that was the point that I learned deeply about shadow work and shadow integration and just the art of looking at projection and how we take things within ourselves that we're too uncomfortable to see and externalize them so that we can start the process of reclaiming them and integrating them. So I did so much of that work and went to the dark and into the depths of myself and came out the other side. And what I learned from that is just that process is cyclical, right? It took us 4.5 years to get pregnant with my son, and a lot of money, and a year of marriage counseling where I didn't know if my marriage was going to make it. And I desperately needed to develop a way of working. That was also a part of where Soil and Shadow came from, is that because we had a non-traditional child conception process and path, it needed time and space that meant that I was not going to be able to pay attention to a 60 to 80 hour a week, flying on planes all the time type of job. I needed a career that afforded me space and time. And so Soil and Shadow was really built around the kind of space and time that we need as women to be whole and to have families the way that we want to have. And more than anything, for our bodies to be healthy and integrated. We bleed once a month. Like, our bodies move in cycles. And so much of the way that we do our careers is not cyclical. It's created around this linear stuff. And so I learned to respect cycles, and that there is a check and balance off switch inside of my psyche and in my body that will actually turn off by itself if I push myself past a certain point. And I am so grateful for that now, because so many of the clients I work with don't have that switch and end up breaking down far worse than I did before they're able to come around to the other side and damage relationships with their children over decades and lose their marriages and all of these things. So, I mean, you can hear the theme that I'm talking about when it comes to how important family is to me. And it was the way I grew up. You know, my parents saw the support of the Black family as being the thing that was going to save us. And so much, I think, of my orientation is that still.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think, I mean, thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing that deep, dark place, which we've all been to. And I think in our own ways, you know, some of us haven't invested the time to think about these concepts you're sharing around be gentle with yourself and know that it's a cycle. So create the mechanisms to help yourself go through that cycle each time it happens, versus expecting like, oh, this is the last time I'll have to deal with it, and moving on in sort of a linear trajectory as we're taught to strive for. So that's really powerful. And I wonder if going back to that dark place is actually where you derive hope because you've gotten out of it, or if there's another sort of, well, I mean, you've mentioned family, which I think is also great, to have that community and support system to help you continue. But is there sort of other places or processes that you've developed to fuel that hope to continue going forward?
Hope is an interesting thing. The way that I've really found hope works the best for me is presence in the moment. And so my meditation practice, my spiritual practice, like I have pretty much redesigned my life so that my spiritual practice is the core of it. And that's where I get hope, because in some ways, hope lives in the future. And I have tried to design my life to stop living in the future. If what I can do is be fully present with who's in front of me and try to create as much presence within them and as much joy within them, so that that joy unlocks the full power of their strategic brain so they can go off and live their purpose, then great. And all I need to do is just be in every moment, try to do that as fully as I can with whoever is right in front of me. And to trust and have faith that the aggregate of that at the end of my lifetime will contribute what it's meant to contribute. Beyond that, it's not actually my business. And so the more I can just stay out of what's not my business and the bigger picture that I can never hope to even hold in my brain, then the more of service I can be in the moment, which means the more impact I will end up having collectively, but I can't be attached to that bigger impact.
Yeah, the power of presence. That's phenomenal. I mean, for people that are thinking about existential future climate crisis type, post-pandemic times as we're filming this during COVID-19, I think it's really hard to sometimes come back to what's happening today, what's happening in my sphere of influence, and I can actually do a lot, which is a great segue into what we've promised our viewers around, what's the one key thing that we all can do to make that positive impact?
Well, it's not going to be surprising based on what you've heard from me, but it's really what I just said around like cultivate your ability to be present right now with whatever your sphere of influence is. And the cool thing about that is the more present you are in the current moment with your current sphere of influence, it tends to then create larger spheres of influence that you can impact as time goes on. And then the more fully present you are in those bigger spheres of influence, the more access you get to bigger spheres of influence. So the skill of not constraining yourself in the present because you're so attached to the future you're trying to create that it spins you out and makes you not perform in the present moment, that is a skill that takes practice. And there's not much in the mainstream world with the way that it works that encourages that behavior. We're encouraged to attach ourselves to these long-term plans and then work backwards and do all of this stuff. And of course, that stuff's useful. Being attached to it and allowing it to impact you to the point where you lose your peace and stability is not cool. So it's cultivating mindfulness. It's cultivating a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. It's all of those things, and knowing that that's where you start. And that if you do that core work, all of the performance, efficiency, innovation, strategy stuff flows from that core place of stability. But your innovation, creativity, strategy, and performance will be deeply negatively impacted if you're not set in your mindset with mindfulness.
Yeah, I think that's liberating in the sense that you can start with one thing. Often there's this sense of overwhelm because we try to look for all the different things that we can do and impact, but it starts with you and it starts with your mind. That I think for me is very liberating to think about. I can control that. If I can control that, the rest will come. I think also that this question is hard often because we know that climate justice, social justice, these are results of systems and institutions and governments and ways that we've constructed around ourselves to live and work and hopefully thrive, although we know that's not happening equitably. So what's your expectation? You've given us great advice for the individual. What's your expectation for those institutions to mobilize more around climate justice?
Yeah. So on the institutional and strategic side of our firm, we use a lot of soil metaphors for how we do that strategic work. So a lot of the advice I give is things like understanding fertility, like the principles of what builds healthy soil and fertile soil are the same principles that create social fertility and fertile social systems and fertile initiatives and projects. And so the advice I would give there is understand the power of co-benefits when you are caring for your people. And what I mean by that is if the people that are working in your initiatives have the conflict resolution structures to perform, if they have working agreements that make things that are implicit and assumed in the system explicit so that everyone can fully participate, like basic organizational development things, if those are taken care of both internally and externally with your strategic partners, then they are going to start creating things that you could not have even imagined. And these are principles of the great organizations, right? Like a lot of the inspiration from Soil and Shadow as well came from Disney, came from Pixar, like looking at the big companies and how they let their people go when it comes to innovation, what structures they use. And those are incredibly fertile systems. They're creatives. So that's what I would say is look at creative entities and how they are able to perform over time, because the climate movement is going to need to become artists of that caliber to really create what we need to create.
Yeah, I am definitely appreciating, again, this consistent return to what makes us human and the artist, creative, and joyful aspects of the work that we can do in the structures that we have set up to do those. So that's a beautiful message. And I think in looking across your career, I'm curious, as you've spent a lot more time than the rest of us going deep and digging in, has there been sort of a favorite aha moment for you? You've already shared a couple, but has there sort of been an epiphany for you, maybe more recently in doing this work?
I think an epiphany for me was the fact that justice could be fun. It was definitely an epiphany. And that grief and fear and sadness, that it was possible to integrate them so thoroughly into my day-to-day life and into rituals that I create to give them time and space, that they didn't compromise my peace. Like that just has to be a lived experience. You can hear someone say it, but the operationalizing of it is really hard, because the way that we're going to have to grieve and process loss as individuals and as a species to do this work well is profound. We're not going to be very happy most of the time. But when I talk about joy and when I talk about peace, that I'm talking about presence, the ability to be connected to whatever's happening. And it's also why I talk about discomfort. You can be uncomfortable and peaceful. You can be grieving and joyful. The dichotomy of that and the polarity of that is inherent to the human experience. And we need to bring that more into the way that we do our work in social impact. So that was an aha.
Yeah, definitely. I am sitting with a lot of these themes that you've given us, and I think it's been such a privilege to be able to hear from your reflections and applications to helping companies, organizations, individuals really contend with that dichotomy and to start to be okay with how complex we are, and then to find the joy in that, which is all hugely applicable to any one of us that is trying to do work that will impact the future and our existence and how our quality of life will look like, but also to not forget about each of us in the process of doing that. So, some of my personal favorite takeaways is this simple message: be present, and to sit with the fact that you can be a bunch of different things at once and that they are all part of our human experience. So don't be so hard on yourself and wondering why it's not a linear progression of I was sad, now I'm happy, or I was broken, now I'm fixed. So thank you so much, Nikki. It's been a true privilege, and I'm excited for our viewers to be able to benefit from all of your wisdom.
Thank you.